Chapter 6 Shasta Among the Tombs. Shasta ran lightly along the roof on tiptoes. It felt hot to his bare feet. He was only a few seconds scrambling up the wall at the far end. When he got to the corner, he found himself looking down a narrow, smelly street. There was a rubbish heap against the outside of the wall, just as Corn had told him. Before jumping down, he took a rapid glance round him to get his bearings. Apparently he had now come over the crown to the island hall on which Tashbaan is built. Everything sloped away before him, flat roofs below flat roofs, down to the towers and battlements of the city's northern wall. Beyond that was the river, and beyond the river a short slope covered with gardens. But beyond that again, there was something he had never seen the like of. A great yellowish gray thing, flat as a calm sea and stretching for miles. On the far side of it were huge blue things, lumpy but with jagged edges, and some of them with white tops. The desert! The mountains! Thought Shasta. He jumped down onto the rubbish and began trotting along downhill as fast as he could in the narrow lane, which soon brought him into a wider street which there were more people. No one bothered to look at a little ragged boy running along on bare feet. Still, he was anxious and uneasy till he turned a corner and saw the city gate in front of him. Here he was, pressed and jostled a bit, for a good many other people were also going out, and on the bridge beyond the gate the crowd became quite a slow procession, more like a queue than a crowd. Out there, with clear running water on each side, it was deliciously fresh after the smell and heat and noise of Tashbaan. When once Shasta had reached the far end of the bridge, he found the crowd melting away. Everyone seemed to be going either to the left or right along the river bank. He went straight up ahead on a road that did not appear to be much used, between gardens. In a few paces he was alone, and a few more brought him to the top of the slope. There he stood and started. It was like coming to the end of the world, for all the grass stopped quite suddenly a few feet before him, and the sand began. Endless level sand, like on seashore, but a bit rougher because it was never wet. The mountains, which now looked further off than before, loomed ahead. Greatly to his relief, he saw, about 5 minutes' walk away on his left, what must certainly be the tombs. Gosh, it's just a little late, sorry. Just as Bree described them. Great masses of moldering stone shaped like gigantic beehives, but a little narrower. They looked very black and grim, for the sun was now setting behind them. He turned his face west and trotted toward the tombs. He could not help looking very hard for any sign of his friends, though the setting sun shone in his face so that he could see hardly anything. And anyway, he thought, of course they'll be round on the far side of the farthest tomb, not this side, where anyone might see them from the city. There were about 12 tombs, each with a low arched doorway that opened into absolute blackness. They were dotted about in no kind of order, so that it took a long time going round this one and going round that one before you could be sure that you had looked round every side of every tomb. This is what Shasta had to do. There was no one there. It was very quiet here out on the edge of the desert, and now the sun had really set. Suddenly, from somewhere behind them, there came a terrible sound. Shasta's heart gave a great jump, and he had to bite his tongue to keep himself from screaming. Next moment, he realized what it was. The horns of Tashbaan blowing for the closing of the gates. "Don't be a silly little coward," Shasta said to himself. "Why, it's only the same noise you heard this morning." But there is a great difference between a noise heard letting you in with your friends in the morning, and a noise heard alone at nightfall, shutting you out. And now the gates were shut, he knew there was no chance of the others joining him that evening. Either they're shut up in Tashbaan for the night, thought Shasta, or else they've gone on without me. It's the sort of thing that Erebus would do. But Bree wouldn't. Oh, he wouldn't, now, would he? In this idea about Aravis, Shasta was once more quite wrong. She was proud and could be hard enough, but she was true as steel, and would never have deserted a companion, whether she liked him or not. Now that Shasta knew that he was going to have to spend the night alone, or it was getting dark every minute, he began to like the look of the place less and less. There was something very uncomfortable about those great, silent shapes of stone. He had been trying his hardest for a long time not to think of ghouls, but he couldn't help up any longer. "Ow! Oh, help!" he shouted suddenly, for at that very moment he felt something touch his leg. I don't think anyone can be blamed for shouting if someone comes up from behind and touches him, not in such a place and at such a time when he was frightened already. Shasta, at any rate, was too frightened to run. Anything would have been better than being chased round and round the burial places of ancient kings with something he dared not look at behind him. Instead, he did what was really the most sensible thing he could do. He looked round, and his heart almost burst with relief. What had touched him was only a cat. The light was too bad now for Shasta to see much of the cat, except it was very big and very solemn. It looked as if it might have lived for long, long years among the tombs alone. Its eyes made you think it knew secrets it would not tell. "Puss, puss," said Shasta, "I suppose you're not a talking cat." The cat only stared at him harder than ever. Then it started walking away, and of course Shasta followed it. It led him right through the tombs and out to the desert side of them. There it sat down bolt upright with its tail curled around its feet and face set towards the desert and towards Narnia in the north, as still as if it were watching for some enemy. Shasta lay down beside it with his back against the cat and his face towards the tombs. Because if one... This is ridiculous. Because if one is nervous, there's nothing like having your face toward the danger and having something warm and solid at your back. The sand wouldn't have seemed very comfortable to you, but Shasta hadn't been sleeping on the ground for weeks and hardly noticed it. Very soon he fell asleep, though even in his dreams he went on wondering what had happened to Bree and Aravis and Wynne. He was wakened suddenly by a noise he had never heard before. Perhaps it was only a nightmare, thought Shasta to himself. At the same moment he noticed that the cat had gone from his back, and he wished it hadn't. But he lay quite still without ever opening his eyes, because he felt sure he would be more frightened if he sat up and looked round at the tombs in the loneliness, just as you or I might lie still with our clothes over our heads. But then the noise came again, a harsh, piercing cry from behind him out of the desert. Then, of course, he had to open his eyes up and sit. The moon was shining brightly. The tombs, far bigger and nearer than he thought they would be, looked gray in the moonlight. In fact, they looked horribly like huge people draped in gray robes that covered their heads and faces. They were not at all the nice things you have near you when you're spending the night alone in a strange place. But the noise had come from the opposite side, from the desert. Shasta had to turn his back on the tombs, he didn't like that very much, and stare out across the level sand. The wild cry rang out again. "I hope it's not more lions," thought Shasta. It was in fact not very like the lion's roar he had heard on the night before when they met Wynne and Aravis, and was really the cry of a jackal. But of course Shasta did not know this. Even if he had known, he would have not wanted very much to meet a jackal. The cries rang out again and again. "There's more than one of them, whatever they are," thought Shasta, "and they're coming nearer." I suppose if they had been entirely sensible, if he had been, I suppose if he had been an entirely sensible boy, he would have gone back through the tombs nearer to the river where there were houses, and wild beasts would be less likely to come. But then there were, or he thought there were, the ghouls. To go back through the tombs would mean going past those dark openings in the tombs, and what might come out of one of them. It may have been silly, but Shasta felt that he'd rather risk the wild beasts. He was just going to run for it when suddenly, between him and the desert, a huge animal bounded into view. As the moon was behind it, it looked quite black, and Shasta did not know what it was, except it had a very big, shaggy head and went on 4 legs. It did not seem to have noticed Shasta, for it suddenly stopped, turned its head towards the desert, and let out a roar which re-echoed through the tombs, and seemed to shake the sand under Shasta's feet. The cries of the other creatures suddenly stopped, and he thought he could hear feet scampering away. Then the great beast turned to examine Shasta. "It's a lion. I know it's a lion," thought Shasta. "I'm done. I wonder will it hurt much? I wish it was over. I wonder does anything happen to people after they're dead? Oh, oh, here he comes." And he shut his eyes and his teeth tight. But instead of teeth and claws, he only felt something warm lying down at his feet, and when he opened his eyes, he said, "Why, it's not nearly as big as I thought. It's only half the size. No, it's even quarter the size. I do declare it's only the cat. I must have dreamed all about it being as big as a horse." And whether he had really been dreaming or no, what was now lying at his feet and staring him out of countenance, with its big, green, unwinking eyes, was the cat. Though certainly one of the largest cats he has ever seen. "Oh, Puss," gasped Shasta, "I am so glad to see you again. I've been having such horrible dreams." And he had once lay down again, back to back with the cat, as they had been at the beginning of the night. The warmth from it spread all over him. "I'll never do anything nasty to a cat again as long as I live," said Shasta, half to the cat and half to himself. "I did once, you know. I threw stones at a half-starved, mangy old stray cat. Hey, stop that!" For the cat had turned round and given him a scratch. "None of that," said Shasta. "It isn't as if you could understand what I'm saying." Then he dozed off. Next morning, when he woke, the cat was gone, the sun was already up, and the sand hot. Shasta, very thirsty, sat up and rubbed his eyes. The desert was blindingly white, and, though there were murmuring noises from the city behind him, where he sat everything was perfectly still. When he looked a little left and west, so that the sun was not in his eyes, he could see the mountains on the far side of the desert, so sharp and clear that they looked only a stone's throw away. He particularly noticed one blue height that divided into 2 peaks at the top, and decided it must be Mount Pyre. "That's our direction, judging by what the raven said," he thought, "so I must make sure of it, so as to not waste any time when the others turn up." So he made a good, deep, straight furrow with his foot, pointing exactly to Mount Pyre. The next job, clearly, was to get something to eat and drink. Shasta trotted back to the tombs. They looked quite ordinary now, and he wondered how he could ever have been afraid of them, and down into the cultivated land behind the river's side. There were a few people about, but not very many, for the city gates had been opened several hours, and early morning crowds had already gone in, so he had no difficulty in a little raiding, as Bree called it. It involved a climb over a garden wall, and the results were 3 oranges, a melon, a fig or 2, and a pomegranate. After that, he went down to the river bank, but not too near the bridge, and had a drink. The water was so nice that he took off his hot, dirty clothes and had a dip, for of course Shasta, having lived on the shore all his life, had learned to swim almost as soon as he learned to walk. When he came out, he lay on the grass, looking out across the water of Tashbaan. all that the splendor and strength and glory in it, but that made him remember the dangers of it too. He suddenly realized that the others might have reached the tombs while he was bathing, and gone on without me, as likely as not. So he dressed in fright and tore back with a speed that he was all hot and thirsty when he arrived, and so the good of his bath was gone. Like most days when you were alone and waiting for something, this day seemed about 100 hours long. About 100 hours long. I'm skipping words. He had plenty to think of course, but sitting alone, just thinking, is pretty slow. He thought a good deal about the Narnians, and especially about corn. He wondered what would have happened when they discovered that the boy who had been lying on the sofa and hearing all their secret plans wasn't really corn at all. It was very unpleasant to think that all these nice people imagined him in trading. But as the sun slowly climbed up to the top of the sky and slowly began going back down to the west, and no one came and nothing at all happened, he began to get more and more anxious. And of course he now realized that when they arranged to wait for one another at the tombs, no one had said anything about how long. He couldn't wait here for the rest of his life, and soon it would be dark again and he would have another night just like last night. A dozen different plans went through his head, all wretched ones, and at last he fixed on the worst of all. He decided to wait until it was dark and then go back to the river and steal as many melons as he could carry and set out for Pyre alone, trusting for his direction to the line that he had drawn that morning in the sand. It was a crazy idea, and if he had read as many books as you have read about journeys over deserts, he would have never dreamed of it. But Shasta had read no books at all. But before the sun set, something did happen. Shasta was sitting in the shadow of one of the tombs when he looked up and saw 2 horses coming towards him. Then his heart gave a leap, for he recognized them as Bree and Win. But the next moment his heart went down to his toes again. There was no sign of Aravis. The horses were being led by a strange man, an armed man, pretty handsomely dressed like an upper slave in a great family. Bree and Win were no longer got up like pack horses, but saddled and bridled. And what could it mean? It's a trap, thought Shasta. Somebody has caught Aravis, and they're probably torturing her, and she's giving the whole thing away. They wanted me to jump out and run up and speak to Bree, and then I'd be caught too. And yet if I don't, I may be losing my only chance to meet the others. Oh, I do wish I knew what happened. And then he sulked behind the tombs, looking out every few minutes, and wondering what was the least dangerous thing to do.